The Prime Minister arriving in Johannesburg for a summit that's supposed to be with leaders representing 2/3 of the world's population.
Death, death, death.
Imagine a country that for decades was considered America's quiet neighbor, and now suddenly dares to say no to Washington. Canada, which the world has come to see as a modest participant in other people's games, is suddenly turning into the main rule breaker on the world security and economic map. While Donald Trump is throwing around tariffs and threats, Ottawa is preparing a response that could hit the U.S. much harder than any duties. Behind the facade of Allied smiles lies a conflict that is not reported in official reports. This is no longer just a dispute over the F-35. For the first time in many years, Canada is seriously considering abandoning the American fighter jet in favor of European and Asian alternatives that could tip the balance of power in the skies over the Arctic and the Pacific Ocean. For the Pentagon, this is not just bad news. It is a potential blow to the entire architecture of NATO and North American defense, where Canada plays a much more important role than is commonly thought. But it doesn't end with military contracts. Under the cover of the trade war, Trump is opening a new front for critical minerals, without which no aircraft will fly, no electric car will run, and no modern factory will operate. Washington has already imposed tariffs on Canada, and at the same time is quietly entering its mining companies as an investor, buying shares in the future nervous system of global industry. It would seem to be a brilliant move, until you realize that with this step, the U.S. is making itself dependent on Ottawa's decisions. While the White House threatens tariffs, Canada is beginning to gather a new circle of partners around itself. Seoul, Brussels, Mexico City, capitals that played secondary roles yesterday, are now becoming key points of support for Ottawa. Joint defense agreements with South Korea, new pacts with Mexico, deepening ties with the European Union. All this adds up to one provocative picture. Canada is building its own security and trade network, in which Washington is no longer the only center of gravity. And here's the main intrigue. For the first time in many years, the U.S. risks finding itself in a position that it has been accustomed to pushing others into, dependent, vulnerable, and deprived of complete control over what is happening on its doorstep. Canada is gaining something it has never had before: leverage over the White House through aircraft, minerals, and alliances in Asia and Europe. One unexpected contract, one boring investment in one new pact, and the balance of power shifts in a way that will be felt in Washington, Brussels, and Beijing. What if the quiet neighbor is no longer quiet, and you just haven't heard about it yet? What if the next big geopolitical mistake by the U.S. happens not in Europe or Asia, but right up north, in a country that they've come to think of as safe and predictable? Watch this video to the end, and you will see how Canada is turning the tariff war and aircraft dispute into an opportunity to rewrite its place in the world and put America in a position it hasn't been in for decades. In recent years, the Canadian government has found itself at the center of a major scandal that could completely overturn the country's defense strategy. The fact is that plans to purchase 88 American-made F-35 airliners, agreed upon several years earlier, have been called into serious question. Prime Minister Mark Carney has ordered a comprehensive review of the contract in light of new circumstances that cannot be ignored, from increased costs to political instability in relations with Washington. Many experts are already calling this story Canada's riskiest gamble in national security in decades. The essence of the problem lies not only in the financial cost, although they are staggering. The initial purchase price of $19 billion has risen to almost $28 billion, and the expected cost of technical equipment and training have reached another $5.5 billion. The modern F-35 fighter jet is truly a technological marvel. But according to many experts, the project is significantly overpriced and far from completion. Problems with software updates, spare parts deliveries, and delays, including with the Block 4 upgrade, are piling up one after another. In addition, the aircraft is heavily dependent on US-controlled supplies and upgrades, raising concerns about Canada's long-term sovereignty. The United States' control over all aspects of Canadian aviation, maintenance, and modernization also raises questions. Recent insider information circulating in military circles suggests that without the permission of the American authorities, the operation of the F-35 in Canada may become impossible. In addition, the fact that a significant portion of the aircraft parts, even those stored in Canada, remain the property of the U.S., reinforces the feeling that Canada remains dependent on the United States not only politically, but also technically. This is causing irritation within the government, given the growing tensions between the two countries against the backdrop of the tariff wars and economic pressure imposed by U.S. leader Donald Trump. But there is another unexpected twist in this drama. Sweden is offering Canada an alternative. Saab, with its Gripen E fighter jets, has made a bold proposal promising to create up to 10,000 Canadian jobs, build factories in the country, and build something more than just aircraft, an entire industrial alliance capable of restoring Canada's independence in the defense sector. This proposal contrasts sharply with the outdated classic scenarios, where Canada was only a symbolic participant in American military programs. Analysts are already saying that such an alliance could lay the foundation for the revival of the Canadian aerospace industry, which is exactly what many defense sector activists are hoping for. All this is happening against the backdrop of open pressure from the American administration. President Donald Trump continues to use economic leverage, imposing unprecedented levels of tariffs and sanctions against Canada. In response, Ottawa is forming a new strategy to focus on domestic production, establishing ties with other regions, and strengthening its own economy, independent of Washington. These political and economic upheavals have resulted not only in a review of military procurement, but also in a serious rethinking of Canada's entire role in the global economy and security. For the first time in decades, Canada is showing a willingness to go against the usual party and alliance lines in order to take a truly independent position. Rumors have spread among unofficial sources that behind the scenes of the political struggle with the U.S., there's even talk of an outrageous move, reducing the number of F-35s purchased to a symbolic 16 aircraft or abandoning them altogether. This caused a real storm in Washington, where officials claim that any deviation from American weapons will weaken North America's defense capabilities. However, Ottawa is confident that the delivery and maintenance of the F-35s in the current tense situation poses a threat to national security. In addition, technical experts are constantly warning about the high costs of maintaining and servicing the aircraft, which further undermines the economic viability of the contract. Thus, the situation is becoming acute, almost dramatic. Some call it Canada's scorched earth strategy, a refusal to depend on those who threaten sanctions and tariffs. Others call it a betrayal of the traditional alliance with the U.S., the greatest threat to the country's security since the end of the Cold War. In any case, for Canadians, there is much more at stake now than just a technical argument. It is a struggle for jobs, industrial revival, and, more importantly, for the future of sovereignty in a world where the old rules no longer apply. This collision between outdated commitments and new geopolitical realities, between economic aid and political will, sets the tone for all of Canada's contemporary foreign policy. And however the current review ends, it is already clear that a taste for independence and a pragmatic approach are forcing Canada to enter a new international arena with a new, unwavering character. The consequences of this shift will be felt not only by Canada and the U.S., but by the whole world. The next stage in the development of Canada's defense strategy is linked to the unexpected activation of European and Asian players, who are actively offering their technologies and solutions that could change the face of the country's military-industrial complex. The most striking example is the Swedish company Saab, with its Gripen E fighter jet, which has already been mentioned as an attractive alternative to the F-35. However, there's much more to this than just a change of equipment supplier. The new player is not just offering aircraft, but proposing to create a real industrial alliance that will cover not only assembly, but also design, repair, training, and technical integration. An offer of this scale has not been seen in Canada in decades, and it is causing a storm of discussion among experts. The very idea of an industrial partnership with Saab is not just an economic deal, but a project of national revival. There is frequent talk behind the scenes that the Swedish proposal involves the creation of nearly 20,000 high-tech jobs, as well as the relaunch of many abandoned aerospace enterprises in Ontario and Quebec. They say that the project envisages the localization of production and research centers capable of not only meeting the needs of the Canadian Armed Forces, but also creating export potential that will make the country a leader in the global defense technology market. This would be a direct blow to the old model, where Canada only modestly participated in U.S. programs, receiving no more than 10 to 15% of the invested funds back into the economy. The Swedish project, on the other hand, has a different philosophy: to build, develop, and master precisely on Canadian territory. At the same time, the significance of new alliances goes far beyond the defense industry. As soon as Canadian politicians began to actively discuss the possibility of strategic cooperation with South Korea, everything became clear. The country had stopped looking only to the West and North. Now the key to its future lay in Asia. South Korean President Lee Chang and Prime Minister Mark Carney signed the most ambitious defense and economic agreement that Canadian diplomacy has concluded in the last 20 years. In addition to intelligence sharing and joint military exercises, this agreement includes cooperation in the fields of energy, critical minerals, and research into new technologies, including artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. This is the first time that Canada has moved away from its restrained interaction with the American bloc and begun to build an independent line in the Indo-Pacific region. Interestingly, there has been repeated discussion among the elite of a secret plan whereby Canada and South Korea could jointly create a new type of multi-role fighter jet capable of operating in the harsh climatic conditions of the North, while also being adapted to modern theaters of war in Asia. It is said that the preparatory stages of this project have already begun in closed meetings between leading Canadian and Korean engineers and military analysts. If this leak is confirmed, it will come as a shock to Washington and Brussels, as such an initiative would put Canada on a par with the major industrial powers and open the way to new trillion-dollar contracts. The economic component should not be overlooked either. The strategy of diversifying export markets and industrial ties is becoming a priority for the Canadian government, against the backdrop of ongoing trade conflicts with the U.S., as well as the risks associated with tougher sanctions against China. Ottawa is actively developing cooperation with the European Union and Mexico. A new large-scale package to expand commercial and technological cooperation with Mexico was recently concluded, including investments in infrastructure, the energy sector, and agriculture. For many analysts, this signaled the beginning of a new phase in Canada's integration into international value chains and regional economic unions, expanding its ability to withstand external pressure. During recent negotiations, European Union leaders expressed clear support for Canada's position, which is already showing 15 to 20% annual growth in trade and technological exchange following the introduction of the so-called CEDA+, an initiative for cooperation in the fields of energy, critical materials, digital trade, and environmental protection. Despite Washington's attempts to curb this process through diplomatic pressure and threats of sanctions, Western and Asian countries, seeing Ottawa's strategic independence, are increasingly viewing Canada as a key ally and promising partner for sustainable economic and military development. These movements are creating a new geopolitical reality in which the role of the Canadian state is being redefined as a bridge between the West and the East, between major economic blocs. In this context, Canada can no longer be considered a passive participant in world politics. Instead, it is taking a proactive stance, building its own multi-vector foreign policy, where an important place is given to new alliances and partnerships that minimize the risks of unilateral decisions by the U.S. Against the backdrop of this shift, there is even unofficial speculation that by the end of 2010,